picture a mahogany table. It's in this heavily draped, smoke-filled room. The year is 1916. Outside, millions of men are dying in the muddy trenches of Europe, fighting a war that has just seemingly ground to a total halt.
Right. It's just a stalemate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But inside this room, two elite, elegantly dressed diplomats are just casually leaning over a massive map. One is British, one is French. And in their hands, they literally hold a ruler.
Just a standard ruler.
Yeah. And with a few casual strokes of a pen, they begin drawing straight lines across the Middle East. They're completely ignoring centuries of tribal boundaries, religious sects, even access to water.
It's unbelievable.
They're quietly carving up a world they haven't even conquered yet.
Yeah.
And planting the seeds for a century of conflict. And the crazy part, the public has absolutely no idea this is happening.
It is a profoundly chilling image, and it really perfectly encapsulates the dark underbelly of how modern history was actually written.
Yeah.
Because we are generally taught that wars start when armies march across borders, right, or when a shot is fired. But the historical record we are unpacking today argues something entirely different.
Which is what makes this so fascinating.
Right. It suggests that the trajectory of the 20th century and the deaths of roughly 75 million people across 2 world wars was actually locked into place long before the shooting started.
Locked in by who?
By secret clauses, whispered backroom promises, and, literal napkin sketches that were never meant to see the light of day.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're going to drag these secret agreements right out of the shadows.
Exactly.
Because when you try to understand a massive global tragedy, it is just human nature to look for a recognizable villain, You want a face on a poster. You think of the loud, aggressive madmen screaming from podiums.
Right, the obvious dictators.
Yeah, but the events we're exploring today force us to pull our focus away from the screaming dictators and look instead at the quiet men in the closed rooms, the diplomats who played these elaborate double games and inadvertently doomed generations.
And as we journey from the late 19th century all the way to the deepest freezes of the Cold War, a really massive, sobering, thematic through line emerges here.
What does it boil down to?
It boils down to 3 harsh realities. First, secret diplomacy almost always backfires catastrophically on the people who invent it.
Always.
Second, appeasing an aggressor doesn't buy peace. It merely subsidizes their next attack. And third, and this is perhaps the most tragic of all, whenever great superpowers sit down to make a secret deal, it is always the small, vulnerable countries that end up paying the price.
They're just treated as collateral.
Worse, they're treated not as sovereign nations, but as currency.
Currency. Wow, that is exactly it. So if you are listening to this right now, get ready.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack how these shadow deals built the modern world, layer by layer, lie by lie.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. We'll explore the hidden agreements that spark global fires. And we are going to build up to a climax that sounds like a Hollywood thriller, but is terrifyingly real.
Oh, the submarine story.
Yes, the story of one lone, completely unknown submarine officer who, at the absolute height of all this diplomatic madness, quite literally saved humanity from nuclear annihilation.
But to understand how we almost reached the apocalypse in the late 20th century, we have to start with the man who meticulously built the ticking time bomb in the 19th. We have to go back to 1870.
Right. If you want to understand the explosions of World War I and World War II, you have to understand the geopolitical earthquake of the Franco-Prussian War.
Exactly.
And at the center of that earthquake is the Chancellor of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, the master puppeteer.
Bismarck is really the crucible of modern secret diplomacy. So in 1870, his Prussian army goes to war with France. And they don't just win, they decisively, humiliatingly crush the French forces.
It was a total rout.
It was. But Bismarck is a man who understands theater as much as military tactics. He doesn't just sign a peace treaty. He marches his army to the outskirts of Paris, walks right into the Palace of Versailles, the absolute crown jewel of French history and pride.
Oh, man.
Right. And right there in the Hall of Mirrors, he orchestrates the unification of the new German Empire.
Which is the ultimate slap in the face.
Yeah.
It's brutal.
Oh, absolutely.
But he goes further than pageantry. He physically amputates a piece of France. He seizes a territory right on their shared border called Alsace-Lorraine. Now, why was this specific piece of land so important? It wasn't just about drawing new lines on a map, right?
Not at all. Alsace-Lorraine was incredibly resource-rich. specifically in coal and iron ore.
Okay.
And in the late 19th century, coal and iron were the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution and, by extension, the military-industrial complex. Taking Alsace-Lorraine fueled Germany's rise as an industrial superpower while deliberately stunting France's.
Talk about kicking them while they're down.
Right. But Bismarck, for all his ruthless pragmatism, was a brilliantly calculating man. He immediately recognized the sheer scale of the danger he had just created. He knew that by taking that territory, he had essentially guaranteed that France would swear eternal revenge.
So he basically injected a permanent poison into European politics.
Yeah.
Germany knew France would eventually want it back.
Yeah.
And France knew Germany knew.
Exactly. Bismarck realized France would inevitably try to strike back, but he also knew France couldn't defeat the new German Empire alone. They would need powerful allies.
So what does he do?
His entire foreign policy for the next 20 years became this obsessive, almost paranoid mission to ensure France never found a friend on the continent. He decided to build a web of alliances so dense and so complex that Germany would always be protected by a wall of allies, leaving France completely isolated.
And this is where the web gets incredibly tangled.
Yeah.
Because you see a frantic flurry of treaty making. You have the Three Emperors League in 1873, which tied Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia together. Then you have the Triple Alliance in 1882, bringing Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy into a pact. Notice who is conspicuously absent from all of these groups: France.
Right. Bismarck is succeeding in his isolation campaign. But keeping these massive competing empires together was incredibly difficult because his two primary partners, Austria-Hungary and Russia, actually despised each other.
They really did.
They were fierce rivals over influence in Eastern Europe, specifically the Balkan Peninsula. Keeping them both tied to Germany required diplomatic acrobatics that bordered on the impossible.
Which brings us to the first major backroom deal that truly defines this era. By 1887, the Three Emperors League basically falls apart because the tension between Austria and Russia reaches a boiling point.
Yeah, it was unsustainable.
So Bismarck is desperate. He needs to keep Russia close and, more importantly, away from France. So he signs what is known as the Reinsurance Treaty with Russia.
And this is the vital detail. It was a completely secret treaty. The public had no idea. But vastly more important is that Germany's other allies, specifically Austria-Hungary, were kept entirely in the dark.
And when you look at the terms of the treaty, you understand why. In this secret agreement, Bismarck promises Russia that if Russia and Austria-Hungary ever end up in a war against each other, Germany will remain strictly neutral.
Yep.
But wait, this is where my brain starts short-circuiting.
Yeah.
He already had a highly public treaty, the Triple Alliance with Austria-Hungary, promising to have their back if they were attacked.
That is the crux of Bismarck's so-called genius diplomacy. He was playing both sides against the middle, making fundamentally contradictory promises.
I kept thinking about this like a grifter who double books dinner dates at the exact same restaurant on the exact same night.
That's a great way to look at it.
He's got Austria sitting at a table in the front window, he's got Russia tucked away at a booth in the back, and he is just sprinting between the kitchen and the dining room, sweating through his suit.
Exactly, wiping his brow.
He's telling Austria, you know, you're my only priority, and then running to the back to tell Russia, hey, I'm not actually with that guy in the front. He's banking entirely on his own overwhelming charisma and situational awareness to make sure these two parties never bump into each other on the way to the coat check.
It's a remarkably accurate analogy because Bismarck's system relied entirely on Bismarck. He was the only person in the German government who fully grasped the impossible web of overlapping and contradictory promises he had made.
The ultimate control freak.
Very much so. He believed he was smart enough to juggle these chainsaws indefinitely, and to his credit, while he was in power, his sheer force of will prevented any major European war. The catastrophic flaw in the system, however, was what happens when the grifter is forced to leave the restaurant.
The chainsaws fall. And they fell hard in 1890. A new, young, incredibly arrogant Kaiser takes the throne, Kaiser Wilhelm II.
Oh boy.
He looks at Bismarck, this aging chancellor who essentially runs the world from his desk, and Wilhelm basically says, I am the emperor, I don't need you.
Yeah.
And he fires Bismarck.
And Wilhelm immediately looks at the secret reinsurance treaty with Russia, which is up for its 3-year renewal, and he flatly refuses to sign it.
Why?
He thinks it's far too complicated, it feels deceitful to his alliance with Austria, and frankly, he believes Germany is now so powerful that they don't need to beg for Russia's friendship.
So what happens? The diplomatic fallout is immediate and devastating. Russia is suddenly left standing out in the cold. They are isolated, terrified of this newly aggressive, unpredictable Germany, and they desperately need a friend.
And who is sitting right across the continent, also completely isolated, nursing a 20-year blood grudge over Alsace-Lorraine and desperate for an ally.
France.
Exactly. The exact nightmare scenario Bismarck spent 2 decades and endless diplomatic energy trying to prevent happens almost overnight.
Wow.
By 1894, France and Russia sign a secret military alliance of their own. It dictates that if Germany attacks France, Russia will immediately mobilize and attack Germany from the east. And if Germany attacks Russia, France will attack from the west.
A two-front nightmare.
Yes. Bismarck's intricate, delicate web is gone. Europe is now cleanly, rigidly, and dangerously sliced into 2 heavily armed camps.
So the continent is split in 2. You have Germany and Austria on one side, France and Russia on the other, but there's one massive global player we haven't talked about yet, Britain.
All right.
Up until this point, British foreign policy was famously defined as splendid isolation, which is such a perfectly British, slightly haughty term.
It really is.
It essentially meant, we are an island, we have an empire where the sun never sets, and we frankly do not care about your petty squabbling borders on the European mainland.
Well, splendid isolation wasn't just a political stance, it was a geographic luxury. Britain's absolute security rested on one single, unshakable pillar, the Royal Navy.
Okay.
They followed the two-power standard, meaning their navy had to be larger than the next 2 largest navies in the world combined. As long as they controlled the oceans, they felt untouchable. They had absolutely no interest in signing binding, entangling treaties with France or Russia.
But then, Kaiser Wilhelm II decides to ruin that luxury too. Starting around 1898, the Kaiser, along with his ambitious admiral, Alfred von Tirpitz, develops this absolute obsession with building a massive German fleet, a fleet of modern battleships.
Yeah, he was fixated on it.
But wait, help me understand this. Germany was a landlocked empire for all intents and purposes. Did they even need a global navy to defend themselves at that point?
Not for continental defense, no. Germany's security relied on its army. But Kaiser Wilhelm suffered from a deep, well-documented inferiority complex regarding the British Empire. I mean, his grandmother was Queen Victoria, after all.
Oh, right. Family drama on a global scale.
Exactly. He wanted Germany to have its place in the sun. He wanted overseas colonies, global prestige, and a grand fleet to project power, exactly like his British cousins. But he fundamentally misunderstood how Britain would react.
How so?
To Wilhelm, a navy was a status symbol. To Britain, a massive German fleet stationed just a few hundred miles away across the North Sea wasn't about prestige. It was a literal existential threat.
Because they're an island.
Precisely. Britain didn't produce enough food to feed its population. If they lost control of the sea lanes even for a few weeks, the island would starve.
So this German naval race completely panics the British establishment. Their splendid isolation suddenly feels terrifyingly lonely. And this deep-seated fear drives Britain directly into the arms of a secret agreement. To counter the German threat, Britain realizes they need friends.
So in 1904, they do the unthinkable. They sign an agreement with their historical, centuries-old rival, France. It's called the Entente Cordiale.
Now, if you read the public text of the Entente Cordiale published at the time, it looks completely harmless. It explicitly was not a military alliance.
Right.
It was essentially a polite agreement to settle old colonial disputes. France agreed to let Britain have a free, uncontested hand in Egypt, and Britain agreed to let France have a free hand in Morocco. Just 2 European empires casually trading administrative control over territories that didn't belong to them in the first place.
Just colonial business as usual, yeah. But tucked away in the classified hidden clauses of this agreement was a tiny, seemingly innocuous promise. A hidden dagger, really. The British and the French agreed that in the event of a major European crisis, they would consult each other.
Consult? It sounds so mild, so diplomatic.
It does. But in the specialized language of secret diplomacy, consult meant something very specific. It meant their top military staffs would quietly start planning together. And that is exactly what happened.
Behind closed doors?
Exactly. British and French generals began meeting in civilian clothes. They started coordinating troop movements, matching up railway schedules, and planning joint defensive strategies against a hypothetical German attack, all completely off the books.
Wow.
The British Parliament, the elected representatives of the people, didn't even fully grasp the depth of this military commitment. This quiet, secret promise to consult became the invisible, unbreakable string that would eventually yank the British Empire into the meat grinder of World War I.
And just to complete the geopolitical set, in 1907, Britain signs a similar agreement with Russia. creating what becomes known as the Triple Entente. So now the battle lines are rigidly drawn in permanent marker.
The Triple Alliance versus the Triple Entente.
Right, all that massive pent-up energy is just waiting for a spark. Which brings us to the Balkans. At this time, the Ottoman Empire is rapidly crumbling. They're referred to as the sick man of Europe. And as they slowly withdraw from the Balkan Peninsula, they leave behind a massive, chaotic power vacuum.
And geopolitics abhors a vacuum. Both Austria-Hungary and Russia look southward at the Balkans and see immense strategic opportunity, but for entirely different reasons.
Break that down for us.
Sure. Austria-Hungary is a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire. They are terrified of rising Slavic nationalism within their own borders, so they want to expand southward to crush those nationalist movements before they spread.
Makes sense from their paranoid perspective.
Right. Russia, on the other hand, views itself as the grand Orthodox protector of all Slavic people, especially the Serbs. They want deep influence in the Balkans. But crucially, Russia also wants something physical. Unhindered access to the Mediterranean Sea through the Bosphorus Straits.
Explain the Bosphorus Straits to me. Why was this such an obsession for the Russian Empire?
Think of the Black Sea as a massive bathtub, and the Russian Navy is sitting inside it. The Bosphorus Straits, a narrow waterway controlled by the Ottoman Empire, is the only drain.
Oh, okay.
It is the only doorway out of that bathtub and into the Mediterranean, and from there to the global oceans. Without guaranteed access through the straits, Russia's southern fleet is functionally useless. It's trapped. A warm water port was an absolute existential necessity for Russian imperial power.
Got it. Which leads us to a secret meeting in 1908 at a place called the Buchloe Conference. And this might be one of the dirtiest, most brazen double-crosses we've uncovered.
Oh, it's wild.
The Austrian foreign minister, a man named Aehrenthal, and the Russian foreign minister, Izvolsky, meet secretly at a castle in Buchloe.
They are there to carve up the Balkan map without alerting the rest of Europe.
Right, and they hammer out a secret, verbal gentleman's agreement. Russia agrees to look the other way and allow Austria to formally annex the territory of Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Yeah.
In return for this massive favor, Austria promises to diplomatically support Russia's bid to finally gain control of the Bosphorus Straits. It's a classic transactional quid pro quo. You get your land, we get our water.
But the timing of execution is everything in secret diplomacy. Izvolsky, the Russian minister, leaves the castle meeting and begins a slow, methodical, diplomatic tour of European capitals, trying to gently gather support for his half of the deal regarding the straits.
Okay, so he's doing the legwork.
Yes. While he is out doing this, Aehrenthal, the Austrian minister, immediately turns around, goes back to Vienna, and publicly announces the annexation of Bosnia to the entire world.
He should pull the trigger. He doesn't wait for Russia at all.
Precisely. Austria unilaterally takes Bosnia. The local Serbs are absolutely furious because they had dreams of Bosnia becoming part of a greater united Serbian state.
Naturally.
And Russia is caught completely off guard. The Russian public is outraged that their government seemingly let Austria step all over their Slavic brothers. So when a panicking Russian government turns to Austria and says, okay, we took the heat for your annexation, now publicly support our claim to the straits like we agreed.
What does Austria say?
Austria essentially shrugs, smiles, and says, we never signed anything. We have no idea what you're talking about.
Wow. They completely hung Russia out to dry.
Yeah.
Why is this specific 1908 Buchloe betrayal so critical to what happens 6 years later? It seems like just another diplomatic spat.
Because you have to look at the profound psychological humiliation it inflicted on the Russian leadership. Russia had failed to protect the Slavic people in Bosnia, and they had been publicly played for absolute fools by Austria.
They looked incredibly weak.
Very weak. The Russian government faced massive destabilizing backlash at home. The psychological takeaway for the Tsar and his ministers was permanent. They basically said, we can never, ever back down in the Balkans again. If we are embarrassed twice, our regime might fall.
So it backed them into a corner.
Exactly. That specific burning humiliation hardwired Russia for war. It guaranteed that the next time a crisis flared up with Austria in the Balkans, Russia would not negotiate. They would mobilize.
And that brings us to the boiling summer of 1914. All the gasoline has been poured over the continent. Europe is divided into two heavily armed, paranoid camps. Navies have been built at back-breaking expense. Russia is desperately seeking redemption, and France is still starving for revenge.
The stage is perfectly, terribly set.
Now the match is struck. June 28, 1914. The city of Sarajevo, located in that very same annexed territory of Bosnia.
Right. A secret, ultra-nationalist Serbian society called the Black Hand, whose motto was literally, terrifyingly, unity or death, had trained a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip.
And on that summer day, Princip steps out of a crowd and assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie.
2 gunshots that shattered the old world order. Now, naturally, Austria-Hungary is enraged. Their future emperor is dead, and they want to crush Serbia, whom they correctly blame for sponsoring and arming the Black Hand.
But Austria has a massive strategic problem.
A huge one. They know that if they attack Serbia, Russia, still stinging bitterly from the 1908 betrayal, will almost certainly intervene to protect the Serbs. And if Russia intervenes, France will intervene. Austria-Hungary is a decaying empire. They cannot fight a two-front war against Russia and France alone.
They desperately need their ally, Germany. Which brings us to the fateful day of July 5, 1914. The Austrian ambassador travels to Berlin, meets with Kaiser Wilhelm II, and basically asks, if we go to war with Serbia and the Russians get involved, are you with us?
And Kaiser Wilhelm issues what historians famously call the blank check. He tells Austria-Hungary that they have Germany's full, unconditional support for whatever military or diplomatic action they choose to take against Serbia.
I really want to push back on this moment, or at least dig deep into the Kaiser's mindset. Did Germany actually want a global, world-ending war at this exact moment? Or were they just aggressively bluffing, thinking, if Germany acts tough enough, Russia will back down and swallow their pride again, just like they did in 1908?
That is the eternal million-dollar debate among historians. But the consensus heavily leans toward the latter. The Kaiser was almost certainly bluffing.
A very dangerous bluff.
Exactly. He thought a swift, brutal, highly localized war between Austria and Serbia would be over before Russia could even get its boots on. He fundamentally underestimated Russian resolve.
Yeah.
But the analogy of the blank check is so incredibly perfect because of what it implies in a financial sense. When you hand someone a signed blank check, you are signing away your own agency.
Right. You have no idea what they're going to write on it.
Exactly. You are giving the payee total unchecked control over your bank account. Wilhelm gave a crumbling, desperate Austrian empire the power to spend Germany's massive military might however they saw fit, without checking the balance or the consequences first. It was an act of staggering, almost incomprehensible geopolitical recklessness.
Because Austria took that blank check straight to the bank and cashed it. On July 23, they send Serbia a formal ultimatum. The public narrative, of course, was that Austria just wanted justice for the assassinated Archduke.
Sure, that's what they said.
But behind closed doors, the Austrian diplomats deliberately designed the demands of this ultimatum to be so harsh, so deeply violating of basic Serbian sovereignty that Serbia had to reject it.
As the British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey noted at the time in absolute shock, it was the most formidable document one independent state had ever addressed to another.
What was in it?
Well, it demanded, among other things, that Austrian police and military officials be allowed to conduct their own investigations on sovereign Serbian soil, which essentially stripped Serbia of its independence. Austria didn't want compliance. They wanted a manufactured, legally justifiable excuse for war.
But Serbia, miraculously, realizes the trap. They agree to almost every single demand, bending over backward to appease Austria, except for the one point that totally destroys their sovereignty. They ask for international arbitration.
A very reasonable request.
Right. But Austria says, not good enough. You didn't accept all of it. And they declare war. And suddenly, all those secret treaties, all those invisible tripwires laid down over the last 40 years are triggered.
The dominoes fall exactly as they were engineered to.
Russia begins to mobilize to protect Serbia.
And we really need to pause and explain what mobilization actually meant in 1914. It wasn't just a leader going on the radio and telling soldiers to get ready. It was a terrifyingly rigid mechanical process.
How so?
Think of it like executing a massive, complex string of computer code. Once you press enter, you can't just pause it. Millions of men, horses, artillery pieces, and rations had to be synchronized to strict, completely inflexible railway timetables.
Wow. Millions of pieces moving at once.
Yes. If a country tried to halt their mobilization halfway through, their entire rail network would jam and collapse, leaving their army stranded, unsupplied, and completely defenseless on the border. So once the Tsar gave the order to mobilize the Russian army, the train had literally left the station. War was mathematically inevitable.
So Russia mobilizes its massive army against both Austria and Germany. Germany panics and demands Russia stop immediately.
Yeah.
Russia ignores them because they literally can't stop without ruining their army. So Germany declares war on Russia.
Yep.
Because of the secret 1894 alliance we talked about, France begins to mobilize to help Russia. So Germany declares war on France. And suddenly, we are at the moment that drags the final hesitant superpower into the fray.
Britain. Up to this point, despite the secret consultations with the French military, Britain is still legally uncommitted. Parliament is fiercely debating whether to stay out of it.
Right. But Germany has a massive geographical military problem. They are facing a two-front war. Their strategy, the famous Schlieffen Plan, dictated that to survive, they had to defeat France incredibly quickly before the massive but slow-moving Russian army could fully arrive from the east.
But they couldn't just attack the French border directly. It was heavily fortified and mountainous.
So what's the workaround?
The only way to quickly flank the French army was to march hundreds of thousands of German soldiers straight through the flat plains of neutral Belgium. Germany asks Belgium for permission to cross their land. Belgium, a tiny neutral nation, says absolutely not. Germany invades anyway.
And this is where the arrogance bred by decades of secret diplomacy reaches a fever pitch. There was a treaty dating all the way back to 1839, the Treaty of London, signed by Britain, France, Prussia, and others, explicitly guaranteeing the permanent neutrality of Belgium.
Yes.
When the British ambassador in Berlin desperately confronts the German chancellor, a man named Bethmann Hollweg, about the invasion, expressing sheer shock that Germany would violently violate this treaty, the German chancellor is genuinely flabbergasted by the British outrage.
He really couldn't believe they cared.
He looks at the ambassador and asks, "You are going to war just for a word neutrality, just for a scrap of paper."
A scrap of paper. It has gone down as one of the most infamous, disastrous phrases in diplomatic history. The German leadership had become so deeply entrenched in their own realpolitik, so hyper-focused on military expediency, railway timetables, and their own secret calculations, that they fundamentally forgot that international law, honor, and public guarantees still mattered to other nations.
That arrogance was their undoing.
Completely. Britain used that arrogant dismissal of a scrap of paper as the moral and legal justification to declare war on August 4th, 1914. The entire globe was now plunging into war, driven almost entirely by secret alliances and military timetables the public largely never voted on.
And you would really hope that once the killing actually started, once the trenches were dug and millions of young men were dying in the mud for yards of territory, the diplomats would realize the catastrophic error of their ways.
You would hope so.
You'd think they'd seek an open, honest peace. But no. The historical record shows us that once the war began, the secret deals didn't stop at all. They just shifted their focus.
They shifted from defensive paranoia to outright imperial greed. While the soldiers fought, the diplomats began carving up the spoils of a world they hadn't even finished conquering yet.
Let's go back to that room I described at the very beginning of the deep dive. The year is 1916. The Ottoman Empire, which had joined Germany in the war, was clearly struggling and beginning to fracture. Britain and France started looking at the vast ancient territories of the Middle East and asking themselves, when we win this thing, who gets what?
Enter Sir Mark Sykes, an aristocrat representing Britain, and François-Georges Picot representing France. Two elite diplomats who meet in absolute secrecy.
This is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I want you to truly visualize the audacity of this moment. These two men take a map of the Middle East, and they literally just draw lines across it with a ruler.
A literal ruler, yes.
They completely disregard centuries of ethnic realities, religious sectarian divides, and natural resources.
They treated an entire region inhabited by millions of people like a blank canvas for their empires. The agreement neatly divided the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire into areas of future British and French control.
So who got what?
Britain allocated itself the territories that roughly make up modern-day Iraq, Jordan, and the strategic area around Haifa in Palestine. France drew a line around what is today Syria, Lebanon, and parts of southern Turkey.
But the sheer jaw-dropping audacity of Sykes-Picot is only fully grasped when you zoom out and look at what the British government was doing at the exact same time to other people. Historians refer to this as the Triple Cross.
The Triple Cross, yes, it's a massive web of deceit.
Let's break this down. While Britain is secretly carving up the Middle East with France, they are simultaneously making completely conflicting promises to two other desperate groups in order to help win the war.
First, the Arabs. The British needed help fighting the Ottoman Turks in the desert. So in 1915, through a series of letters between Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, and Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, the British made a solemn promise.
What did they promise?
They said, if the Arabs rise up and revolt against the Ottoman Empire, Britain will recognize and support a massive independent Arab kingdom after the war.
This is the famous Arab Revolt.
Yeah.
If you've seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, this is exactly what it's about. You have Arab forces bleeding and dying in the desert, blowing up trains, fighting alongside the British because they genuinely believed they were fighting for their own sovereign, unified nation.
Exactly. But the borders of that promised independent Arab kingdom directly overlapped with the territories Britain had just secretly promised to France and to themselves in the Sykes-Picot map.
Unbelievable. And as if a massive double cross wasn't enough to secure their interests, we get to the third layer. In November 1917, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, writes a public letter to Lord Rothschild, a prominent leader of the British Jewish community. This becomes known as the Balfour Declaration.
The declaration states that the British government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate this.
So let me just synthesize this because it's staggering.
Yeah.
Britain has essentially promised the exact same piece of priceless real estate to 3 different groups.
Yes, they did.
They promised an independent state to the Arabs to get them to bleed for the war effort. They promised a Jewish homeland to the Zionists to garner global, particularly American and Russian, Jewish support.
Yeah.
And they promised the actual on-the-ground administrative control of the entire region to themselves and the French.
It is a profound historic betrayal. The conflicting promises made in those closed rooms directly sowed the seeds for the modern Middle East and the Israel-Palestine conflict.
The lines they drew are still bleeding today.
Precisely. The arbitrary, ruler-straight borders drawn by Sykes and Picot created artificial states that forced rival groups together and split communities apart, leading to instability that has plagued the region ever since. It is the ultimate proof of our thesis: small nations and millions of ordinary people pay the long-term bloody price for the short-term geopolitical expediency of superpowers.
It's just devastating to see the direct causal line from a secret map in a smoky room in 1916, the headlines we read on our phones today. But the British weren't the only ones playing incredibly dangerous secret games during the war. We have to talk about Germany's ultimate blunder, the Zimmermann telegram.
Oh, this is a crazy one.
This happens in early 1917. Up to this point, the United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, has remained strictly neutral. Wilson actually won his re-election campaign on the incredibly popular slogan, "He kept us out of war."
But the war was going terribly for Germany. The British naval blockade was slowly, methodically starving the German population. Germany realized they had to take a desperate gamble. They decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare.
Meaning what, exactly?
This meant their U-boats would sink any ship, including American civilian and merchant ships approaching Britain. They knew, without a doubt, that sinking American ships would likely drag the U.S. into the war against them.
So the German Foreign Secretary, a man named Arthur Zimmermann, comes up with what has to be one of the most absurd cartoon villain plots in the history of diplomacy. He sends a highly classified, encrypted telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico.
The message instructs the ambassador to approach the Mexican government with a shocking proposal. If the United States declares war on Germany because of the submarines, Mexico should immediately declare war on the United States and attack them from the south.
And what does Mexico get out of this?
In exchange, Germany promises to provide financial support and help Mexico militarily reconquer the lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona.
Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. He is literally offering to carve up the continental United States. I mean, did Zimmermann really, truly think that Mexico, which was right in the middle of its own chaotic, bloody civil revolution, had the military capacity to invade Texas?
It was a delusion born of utter strategic desperation. He wanted to tie the American army down on their own border so they couldn't sail to Europe.
A massive miscalculation.
Huge. But what transforms it from a foolish idea into a massive diplomatic disaster is that the British intelligence services, specifically a brilliant, highly secretive cryptography unit known as Room 40, intercepted the telegram, managed to decode it, and then quietly, strategically handed it over to the Americans.
When the telegram was leaked and published in the American press in March 1917, the American public was absolutely outraged. The entire psychology of the country flipped overnight from staunch isolationists to demanding German blood. A month later, the United States formally entered the war.
It backfired spectacularly.
And I love the historical footnote here, too. Zimmerman was actually asked by an American journalist if the telegram was real. He could have claimed it was British propaganda, forgery.
Yeah.
But instead, he just arrogantly said, yes, it's genuine.
It is arguably the first time in modern history that a single intelligence intercept directly pushed a global superpower into a world war. It's the ultimate example of secret diplomacy literally blowing up in the face of the nation that attempted it.
So the fresh American troops enter the meat grinder, the tide finally turns, and in November 1918, the guns fall silent. The Great War ends, the empires collapse. Which brings us to the aftermath. The fighting is over, but the diplomats go right back into their closed rooms.
Naturally.
In January 1919, the victorious nations gather in Paris to write the peace treaty, the infamous Treaty of Versailles.
And this is where the exhausted idealism of the global public clashes violently with the vindictive pragmatism of the old world diplomats. American President Woodrow Wilson arrives in Europe, and he is greeted almost like a messiah.
People loved him.
They did. He brings his famous 14 points for peace, and his very first absolute core demand is for open covenants of peace, openly arrived at. He passionately wants to end secret diplomacy forever. He believes that every nation has the right to self-determination, not to be traded like poker chips.
But the historical record tells us exactly what happens the moment the doors close at Versailles. The real world-shaping decisions aren't made in the open democratic assembly. They are made in a single guarded room by the Big Four: Wilson from the U.S., Lloyd George from Britain, Clemenceau from France, and Orlando from Italy.
The Big Four.
And Wilson's grand idealism is immediately and systematically crushed by the vengeful realities of the European leaders.
You have to understand the trauma driving George's Clemenceau of France. He had seen his country invaded and devastated by Germany twice in his lifetime, first in 1870, and now the unimaginable slaughter of World War I.
He wanted payback.
Exactly. He didn't want a fair, balanced peace. He wanted a punitive peace. He wanted Germany crushed so severely, economically and militarily, that they could never, ever rise again. Lloyd George of Britain was slightly more pragmatic. He wanted Germany punished to appease his voters, but not entirely destroyed because Britain desperately needed a stable German economy to trade with.
The result of this clash is the actual treaty forced upon Germany. And when the German delegation is finally allowed into the room on June 28, 1919, it wasn't a negotiation. They weren't allowed to speak. It was a dictation. And the most infamous, psychologically damaging part is Article 231, known as the War Guilt Clause.
Germany was forced, at gunpoint essentially, to legally accept sole 100% responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the entire war.
Which is just factually untrue.
Right. Now, historically speaking, as we've just discussed with the Austrian blank checks, the Russian mobilizations, and the secret French-British alliances, the blame was far, far more shared. But the victors needed a legal basis to extract money to pay off their own massive war debts.
And extract they did. They slapped Germany with a staggering reparations bill of 132 billion gold marks. Just to put that into perspective, Germany didn't finish paying off the interest on that specific debt until the year 2010.
91 years later.
91 years. On top of that, their pride, their army, is reduced to a glorified police force of 100,000 men. They are forbidden from having an air force or submarines. The vital industrial Rhineland region is demilitarized, and they lose vast amounts of European territory in all their overseas colonies.
It was a peace built entirely on humiliation and economic ruin, and there was a prophet of doom sitting right there in the British delegation who saw exactly what this vindictive treaty would cause. John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist.
What did he do?
He was so deeply disgusted by the short-sighted, destructive nature of the treaty that he resigned and walked out of the conference.
He goes home in 1919 and writes a blistering book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He explicitly predicts that if you crush the German economy like this, if you strip them of their industry and force them into perpetual debt, they will never recover. The middle class will be wiped out by inflation, and the resulting desperation will inevitably lead to violent revolution or another massive war.
A hauntingly accurate prediction.
He was accurately predicting the conditions for World War II before the ink on World War I was even dry.
And the tragic irony, the final nail in the coffin of Wilson's idealism, is what happened to the League of Nations. The League was Wilson's brainchild, the one institution created at Versailles designed to provide a public forum to resolve disputes and prevent future wars. But Wilson returns to America, suffers a massive, debilitating stroke while trying to campaign for it, and the U.S. Senate completely refuses to ratify the treaty. They retreat back into isolationism. The United States, the newly rising global superpower, refuses to join the League of Nations.
It's like building a state-of-the-art high-tech security system for a massive bank and then intentionally leaving the main vault door wide open. The League of Nations without American military and economic backing was a tiger without teeth. It could issue strongly worded letters, but it couldn't enforce anything.
Yeah, it's powerless.
And this massive power vacuum sets the stage for the disastrous, cowardly policies of the 1930s, the era of appeasement.
Exactly as Keynes predicted, the profound humiliation of Versailles, combined with the global economic devastation of the Great Depression, provided the incredibly fertile, desperate soil from which Adolf Hitler rose to power. By 1933, he is chancellor. By 1934, he is the absolute Führer.
And his entire wildly popular domestic political platform is built on one simple promise, tearing up the hated Treaty of Versailles.
And he doesn't do it all at once. He is cunning. He does it piece by piece, constantly testing the waters to see what the traumatized democracies of the West will tolerate. In 1935, he publicly announces that Germany is rearming, rebuilding its army, and creating a massive air force in direct, blatant violation of the treaty.
And what do Britain and France do?
They send a diplomatic protest note. Nothing else. No sanctions, no military action.
Which leads right into a massive, secret betrayal that fractured the fragile peace. Britain, acting entirely in its own short-term self-interest, decides to make a side deal with the devil. In June 1935, Britain and Germany sign the Anglo-German Naval Agreement.
Yeah, this one is hard to wrap your head around.
Wait, I really need you to explain the logic here. Britain, the country that went to war in 1914, partly because they were absolutely terrified of a German naval buildup, actively signs a piece of paper giving Hitler permission to rebuild his navy.
It sounds absurd in hindsight, but the agreement allowed Germany to build a navy up to 35% the size of the British Royal Navy.
35%.
Right. The British diplomatic establishment rationalized it by thinking, well, Hitler's going to rearm anyway. 35% is better than them building a 100% size navy in secret, so at least we're putting a legal cap on it that we can monitor.
But what about their allies?
Well, that's the catastrophic secret betrayal. The betrayal here was against their own ally, France. Britain did not consult or even warn France before signing this agreement with Hitler.
They just shattered the Stresa Front. To clarify for our listeners, the Stresa Front was an agreement made just months prior between Britain, France, and Italy, where they basically held hands and promised to stand united against any German expansion. And Britain just lets go of France's hand to make a side deal.
Exactly. France was absolutely furious and felt completely isolated once again. And the message this backroom deal sent to Hitler was loud, clear, and unmistakable. The Allies are selfish and divided. They do not trust each other. You can easily play them off one another.
Which gives Hitler the immense confidence for his next massive gamble, the Rhineland Bluff of 1936. The Rhineland was a highly strategic, industrial German territory directly bordering France. The Treaty of Versailles mandated it remain completely demilitarized as a physical buffer zone to protect France. Hitler decides to march his troops right back in.
It was a monumental risk. It violated Versailles and the Locarno treaties, which reaffirmed those borders.
So what was his backup plan?
Well, historical archives reveal Hitler's secret, incredibly revealing orders to his generals that day. The German military was still desperately weak at this point. They were nowhere near ready for a real war. Hitler explicitly told his commanders, if the French military responds and crosses the border to stop us, retreat immediately. Do not fire a single shot. Turn around and run.
Are you serious?
Oh, absolutely. Germany only sent a few lightly armed battalions on bicycles and horseback. If France had mobilized even a single regiment, the German army would have fled, and Hitler's entire regime might have collapsed overnight from the public humiliation.
But France did nothing. They looked to Britain for support, and Britain basically told France, look, Germany's just walking into their own backyard, let it go, it's not worth a war.
And because nobody called his bluff because they let him break the rules without consequence, Hitler's confidence absolutely skyrocketed.
He figured out the game.
He realized a fundamental truth about the 1930s. The Western democracies were so traumatized by the memory of World War I that they would do almost anything, sacrifice almost anyone to avoid another conflict.
Which culminates in the darkest, most shameful moment of appeasement diplomacy. The Munich Agreement of September 1938. Hitler demands the Sudetenland. This is the heavily fortified German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia.
It's vital terrain.
Right. This region contained all of Czechoslovakia's mountain defenses and their heavy industry. If they lose the Sudetenland, They are completely defenseless against a German invasion.
So British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid war, flies to Germany 3 separate times to meet personally with Hitler. Finally, at a conference in Munich, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany sign an agreement giving the Sudetenland to Hitler.
But the most horrifying, gut-wrenching detail here, the one that perfectly encapsulates our theme, that small countries pay the ultimate price. Czechoslovakia wasn't even allowed in the room.
It's heartbreaking.
The Czech diplomats had to wait out in the hall, agonizing, while their sovereign country was literally carved up and given away by foreign powers to appease a dictator.
Chamberlain returns to London, steps off the plane, waves the signed piece of paper in the air, and famously, tragically declares to cheering crowds, "I believe it is peace for our time."
And how long did that last?
Less than 6 months later, Hitler broke his promise. His army simply rolled in and took the rest of Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. Appeasement had failed completely. It didn't prevent war. It just gave Hitler the factories and the strategic position he needed to wage it.
Winston Churchill saw it coming, didn't he?
He did. Churchill, who was a lonely, mocked voice in opposition at the time, summarized the failure perfectly to Chamberlain in Parliament. He said, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war."
September 1939. The illusion of peace shatters and war arrives. But it begins with an unholy, mind-bending alliance that stunned the entire globe. This brings us to the deals with the devil.
August 23rd, 1939. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The foreign ministers of Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union sit down and sign a 10-year non-aggression pact.
Which, if you know anything about these two regimes, makes absolutely zero ideological sense. Fascism and communism were mortal blood enemies. Hitler had built his entire political career, wrote entire chapters of Mein Kampf, promising to destroy communism and conquer Russian land for living space.
Yeah, they hated each other.
And Stalin had spent the 1930s purging his own military of anyone suspected of fascist sympathies. Why on earth would they sign a peace treaty?
The public announcement of the pact was shocking enough to the world, but the secret protocol physically attached to the back of the document was what truly sealed the fate of millions in Eastern Europe.
What was on the back?
Hidden entirely from the world, the pact contained a map, much like Sykes-Picot, dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany would get Western Poland and Western Lithuania. The Soviet Union would get Eastern Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia. They calmly agreed to split sovereign nations that didn't belong to them right down the middle.
It's Sykes-Picot all over again, but this time backed by panzer tanks and the Red Army. It's absolutely chilling. So Poland was completely doomed by a secret handshake before the first bomb even dropped.
Doomed from the start.
On September 1st, Germany invades Poland from the west, utilizing their terrifying new blitzkrieg tactics. Britain and France finally declare war. And then on September 17th, while the Polish army is desperately fighting the Nazis in the west, the Soviet Union suddenly invades them from the east. Poland is crushed in a vice, erased from the map.
We must critically analyze Stalin's massive strategic miscalculation here. Stalin thought he was an absolute geopolitical genius for signing this pact. He believed that by staying neutral and carving up Poland, he was directing Hitler's aggressive war machine westward toward Britain and France.
So he thought he bought himself time.
Exactly. He assumed the capitalists and fascists would bleed each other dry in a long, drawn-out trench war, exactly like World War I. This, he thought, would give the Soviet Union years to safely modernize its own military and industry.
But he totally, catastrophically misread Hitler's timeline and the speed of modern mechanized warfare. There was no long trench war. France unexpectedly falls in just 6 weeks in 1940. Britain is chased off the continent at Dunkirk.
And then the betrayal happens.
Right. In June 1941, Hitler tears up the pact, turns his massive battle-hardened army around, and launches Operation Barbarossa, the largest, most devastating surprise invasion in human history, aimed directly at the Soviet Union.
Stalin was reportedly so deeply stunned by the betrayal that he retreated to his dacha, his country house, and suffered a severe nervous breakdown for several days, refusing to take command. His secret, cynical calculation had backfired, bringing the deadliest war in history right to his doorstep.
The war on the Eastern Front becomes a theater of unimaginable cruelty and scale. Tens of millions of Soviet citizens die. But eventually, the sheer manpower of the Red Army and the brutal Russian winter turn the tide. The Soviet army begins inexorably pushing the Nazis back toward Berlin.
The momentum shifts.
The U.S. and Britain invade France on D-Day, and the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany becomes merely a matter of time.
Which means, as always, the diplomats have to start drawing maps again. And this brings us to what I consider the most visceral, ugly, and revealing example of secret diplomacy in modern history, the Percentages Agreement.
Oh, this one is rough.
The date is October 1944. Allied victory is certain, but the post-war borders of a shattered Europe are not. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill flies to Moscow to meet late at night with Joseph Stalin.
Churchill is deeply anxious. The massive Red Army is sweeping across Eastern Europe, ostensibly to liberate countries like Poland and Romania from the Nazis. But Churchill knows Stalin plans to keep his troops there and install communist puppet regimes.
He sees the writing on the wall.
Churchill wants to salvage whatever British imperial influence he can, specifically in the Mediterranean, to protect the sea routes to the Suez Canal and India. Specifically, he needs Greece to remain allied with the West.
I want you to imagine you were sitting at the table during this meeting because it is terrifyingly casual. Churchill and Stalin are sitting together drinking. Churchill takes a half sheet of paper, literally a scrap, and he writes down a list of Eastern European countries with percentages next to them.
Percentages of what?
These percentages represent how much post-war control the Soviet Union and the Western Allies will have over these nations. It reads like a grocer's list. Romania, Russia, 90%, the others 10%. Greece, Great Britain, 90%, Russia, 10%, Yugoslavia, 50-50, Hungary, 50-50, Bulgaria, Russia, 75%, the others 25%.
Let's pause on the why here. Why did Stalin happily take 90% of Romania and Bulgaria? Because those countries physically border the Soviet Union. They provide a massive physical land buffer against any future invasions from the West. And Churchill takes 90% of Greece because Greece controls the Mediterranean naval choke points.
It's pure cold strategy.
So Churchill writes this down, and he slides this piece of paper across the table to Stalin. Stalin reads it. He takes a large blue pencil, makes a single heavy tick mark on the paper to signify his absolute agreement, and slides it back.
A single tick mark.
Churchill looks at the paper and says, "Might it not be thought rather cynical if it seemed we had disposed of these issues, so fateful to millions of people, in such an offhand manner? Let us burn the paper."
But Stalin tells him, no, you keep it. Think about the sheer gravity of what just happened in 3 seconds with a blue pencil. The destinies, the freedoms, the lives of millions of Romanians, Bulgarians, and Greeks, whether they would live under a brutal Soviet totalitarian regime or a Western democratic system, were decided not by treaties, not by the will of the people, not by elections, but by a blue tick mark on a scrap of paper over drinks in Moscow.
It's the absolute distillation of our theme. Small nations are nothing but the currency of superpowers.
It really is.
It makes my stomach turn. And that deeply cynical, transactional nature of the Grand Alliance just gets darker and more paranoid at our next stop. Fast forward to July 1945. Germany has finally surrendered in ruins. The Allied leaders meet at the Potsdam Conference in Germany to finalize the New World Order.
But the dynamic is totally different now.
Exactly. The faces at the table have completely changed. Franklin Roosevelt has died, so his vice president, Harry Truman, is now president of the U.S. Churchill actually gets voted out of office mid-conference and is replaced by Clement Attlee. Only Stalin remains from the original Big Three.
And the atmosphere at Potsdam is completely different from previous wartime conferences. The mutual trust, which was always incredibly thin and built on the necessity of defeating Hitler, is totally gone. It is replaced by intense, icy paranoia.
Right. And during the conference, President Truman receives a highly classified, coded message. It informs him that the Trinity test, the first successful detonation of an atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert, was an absolute success.
That game changer.
America now possesses a weapon of unimaginable apocalyptic destruction. Truman decides he needs to tell Stalin about it, but he wants to do it casually, to establish dominance and warn Stalin not to push the U.S. without causing a diplomatic panic.
So during a break in the meetings, Truman walks up to Stalin without his own American interpreter.
Yeah.
He uses the Soviet interpreter and simply vaguely mentions that the United States has developed a new weapon of unusually destructive force.
He doesn't say atomic.
He deliberately doesn't use the words nuclear or atomic.
Truman watches Stalin's face closely, expecting a reaction of shock or awe or a million panicked questions about this superweapon. But Stalin barely reacts. He's completely unbothered. He just nods, casually says he hopes America makes good use of it against the Japanese, and walks away to have a cigar.
Just walks away.
Truman and Churchill are entirely baffled. They regroup and think, does he not understand what we just told him? Did the translation fail?
Oh, he understood perfectly. The historical reveal is why he didn't react. Stalin already knew about the atomic bomb. In fact, he knew about the Manhattan Project before Truman even became vice president.
Wait, how is that possible?
Because Soviet intelligence had deeply infiltrated the American and British nuclear programs. Specifically, a brilliant theoretical physicist named Klaus Fuchs, who worked at Los Alamos, was passing highly classified atomic blueprints directly to Soviet handlers.
So picture this moment. You have these two men, the leaders of the two most powerful nations on Earth, standing face to face in the ruins of Germany, completely lying to each other.
Lying through their teeth.
Truman is hiding the true nuclear nature of the bomb, and Stalin is hiding the fact that he already knows all about it and is actively stealing the blueprints to build his own. Historians often pinpoint this exact moment of mutual, silent deception as the true psychological beginning of the Cold War.
The hot war wasn't even officially over with Japan yet, and the next, infinitely more dangerous war had already silently begun.
And that transition is practically seamless. As we move into the Cold War, the fundamental nature of global diplomacy changes. It's no longer just about conquering physical territory with armies, it's an ideological war.
Defined by new weapons.
Right. It is defined by economic blackmail, proxy conflicts in the Third World, espionage, and the looming daily terror of mutual nuclear annihilation. In March 1946, Churchill delivers his famous speech in Missouri, declaring that an iron curtain has descended across the continent, dividing the Soviet-influenced totalitarian East from the democratic West.
Which brings us to a fascinating piece of economic diplomacy, the Marshall Plan in 1948. Europe is absolutely devastated. Cities are rubble, infrastructure is gone, people are quite literally starving in the streets.
The situation was dire.
The United States government realizes something crucial. If they don't help rebuild Western Europe quickly, the sheer economic despair will make the promises of communism look very, very appealing to the starving masses in France and Italy.
So what's the plan?
Secretary of State George Marshall proposes a massive, unprecedented aid package, $13 billion, which is roughly $150 billion in today's money, to rebuild the continent.
The Marshall Plan is widely remembered today as a triumph of American generosity and brilliant strategic foresight. But the diplomatic archives provide a secret context that fundamentally changes how we view the rigid division of Europe.
Oh, this part is wild.
The United States didn't just offer the Marshall Plan money to Western Europe. They officially publicly offered it to the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states as well.
Wait, help me understand that. Why on earth would the U.S. offer billions of dollars to rebuild the economy of their emerging archenemy?
It was a highly calculated diplomatic bluff. The U.S. suspected and hoped that Stalin would refuse the money. By offering it, the U.S. looked incredibly magnanimous and peaceful to the rest of the world, while simultaneously casting Stalin as the cruel villain who rejected aid for his own suffering people.
So they didn't think he'd take it.
But historically, there was a very real tense window where it might have happened. Stalin initially showed intense interest. The Soviet economy was utterly ruined. They had lost 27 million people. They desperately needed the industrial machinery and capital the U.S. was offering.
So why did he ultimately say no? And why did he force countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia, whose leaders desperately, openly wanted the money to rebuild their shattered cities, to reject it too?
Because Stalin, deeply paranoid, had his economists read the fine print of the offer. Accepting Marshall Plan dollars required opening up your domestic economy to American audits, sharing economic data, and integrating with Western free markets.
There's the catch.
Stalin realized, entirely correctly from his perspective, that the Marshall Plan was an economic Trojan horse. Think of it as economic gravity. Once your banks and industries rely heavily on American dollars and American machinery, your political loyalty will inevitably eventually orbit Washington.
That makes perfect sense from his point of view.
If he let American dollars into Eastern Europe, American political influence and democratic ideas would follow, and his iron totalitarian grip over the region would loosen.
So he forces the entire Eastern Bloc to refuse the aid. History views this moment as a literal fork in the road for human development. Western Europe takes the $13 billion, rebuilds its infrastructure, integrates its economies, and becomes incredibly prosperous and democratic.
Then the East.
Eastern Europe, forced by Stalin's paranoia to rely solely on the shattered, dysfunctional Soviet command economy, stagnates under brutal totalitarian rule for the next 40 years. The Iron Curtain wasn't just a military border made of barbed wire. It became a massive, unbridgeable economic chasm dug primarily by Stalin's fear of a secret American agenda.
And that intense fear, that escalating paranoia between Washington and Moscow, fed an arms race that grew year by year. They built thousands of nuclear weapons, engaged in proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, until it reached its absolute terrifying zenith in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
This is the moment the entire world actually stopped breathing for 13 days.
It really was.
Yeah.
American U-2 spy planes discovered that the Soviet Union is secretly installing medium-range nuclear ballistic missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. They could vaporize Washington, D.C. in minutes with zero warning.
The ultimate part.
President John F. Kennedy gathers his top advisors, the XCOM, and they desperately debate what to do. The military advisors, the generals, are screaming for immediate massive airstrikes to destroy the launch pads, followed by a full-scale Marine invasion of Cuba.
But as Attorney General Robert Kennedy wisely noted during those tense meetings, they realized that launching an unprovoked, surprise military attack on a small neighboring nation would be viewed globally as America's Pearl Harbor in reverse.
The optics would be terrible.
It would destroy America's moral standing and almost certainly force the Soviets to respond by invading West Berlin, triggering World War III. So President Kennedy opts for a naval blockade, which he carefully terms a quarantine, surrounding Cuba with American warships to prevent any more Soviet weapons from arriving.
The tension is indescribable. You have Soviet cargo ships, escorted by submarines, sailing straight toward a solid line of heavily armed American destroyers in the Atlantic. If the Soviets try to run the blockade, the Americans have orders to fire. If they fire, the Soviet Union will retaliate, and World War III begins.
They were so close.
As Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously whispered, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked.
The Soviet ships physically turned around rather than challenged the blockade.
But that was only half the problem. The crisis wasn't over. The nuclear missiles already installed in Cuba were still there, and the CIA reported they were rapidly becoming fully operational.
The standoff continues. Publicly, Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev were engaged in a terrifying, rigid standoff, trading aggressive, threatening letters on the world stage. Neither man could afford to look weak to their own militaries. But privately, in the shadows, we have the back-channel deal.
This is the deal that literally saved the world, but the terms of it were kept completely secret from the global public for decades. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, secretly meets late at night with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin, in a small room at the Justice Department. They hammer out a desperate compromise.
Khrushchev agrees to publicly dismantle and remove all the missiles from Cuba under UN inspection. In exchange, Kennedy privately promises that the U.S. will lift the blockade and never invade Cuba.
But the Soviets wanted more, right?
Yes, that wasn't enough for the Soviets to save face. They demanded a reciprocal concession. The U.S. must remove its own Jupiter nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey, which directly bordered the Soviet Union and threatened Moscow.
Kennedy agrees to remove the missiles from Turkey, but he insists on one absolute non-negotiable condition. This part of the deal must remain a total secret. The public can never know that America traded away the Turkey missiles.
Right.
Why did it have to be secret? If you were successfully saving the world from nuclear fire, why hide the terms of the peace?
Because of international optics and the fragile politics of the NATO alliance, the Jupiter missiles in Turkey were technically NATO weapons deployed to protect Europe. If Kennedy publicly traded away allied NATO assets to solve a purely American security problem in Cuba, he would look incredibly weak, selfish, and the European allies would completely lose faith in America's promise to defend them with its nuclear umbrella.
So it was about keeping the alliance together.
Exactly. So Khrushchev, who was under immense pressure from Soviet hardliners, had to take the massive public humiliation of seemingly retreating from Cuba unconditionally, trusting entirely in Kennedy's secret, verbal, backroom promise to quietly dismantle the Turkey missiles months later.
It is a profound, almost absurd paradox. The exact kind of secret, unrecorded, backroom dealing that caused all the mistrust and triggered World War I is the exact same mechanism that prevented World War III.
It really is wild when you put it like that.
But as terrifying as that high-level negotiation was, the historical archives reveal that the true, heart-stopping climax of the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't happen in the Oval Office or the Kremlin. It happened deep underwater. And this is the story I promised at the very beginning of our deep dive. The story of a man named Vasily Arkhipov.
October 27, 1962. Historians widely consider it the single most dangerous day in human history. A Soviet diesel-powered submarine, designated the B-59, is hiding deep in the Atlantic Ocean near the American quarantine line.
They're completely cut off.
Yes, it has been submerged for days, trying to evade detection. The submarine's air conditioning system has completely broken down. The temperature inside the metal tube is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew is exhausted, dehydrated, and suffering from severe carbon dioxide poisoning. Men are fainting at their posts.
And on the surface above them, American destroyers have located them. The Americans are dropping practice depth charges, small explosives, trying to rattle the submarine and force it to surface and identify itself. But the Americans do not know one absolutely crucial, terrifying detail.
What's that?
The B-59 is armed with a specialized nuclear torpedo that carries the explosive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima.
Furthermore, because they are hiding so deep to evade the destroyers, the submarine has lost all radio contact with Moscow. They haven't received a message in days. They have absolutely no idea what is happening in the political standoff on the surface.
They're completely in the dark.
For all they know, the diplomatic talks failed and the bombs have already started falling on Russia. As the depth charges detonate closer and closer, violently rocking the hull, the submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, reaches his absolute breaking point. Blinded by exhaustion and fear, he concludes that World War III has already begun. He orders the nuclear torpedo to be armed and prepared for immediate launch against the giant American aircraft carrier, the USS Randolph, operating above them.
If he fires that torpedo, the carrier and thousands of American sailors are vaporized instantly. The U.S. Navy responds with full nuclear retaliation against the Soviet Union, and humanity as we know it likely ends in a radioactive firestorm within hours.
The end of the world.
But Soviet naval protocol, a bureaucratic rule that saved the world, required the unanimous consent of the 3 senior officers on board to launch a nuclear weapon without direct, confirmed orders from Moscow.
The captain, Savitsky, says yes, we must fire. The political officer, the party loyalist on board, says yes. It all comes down to the third man, the second command of the flotilla, who just happened to be on that specific sub, Vasily Arkhipov.
Sweating in the dark, suffocating on bad air, listening to explosives detonate around him, with his commanding officer screaming at him to launch and avenge their homeland, Vasily Arkhipov remains incredibly, unbelievably calm. He looks at his captain and simply says no.
Incredible courage.
He argues that they do not have enough information. He reasons that if war had actually started, the Americans would be using real weapons to destroy them, not just dropping warning charges. He insists that the depth charges are a signal demanding they surface, and that they cannot, under any circumstances, start a global nuclear war based on an assumption in the dark.
He talks him down.
He talks the captain down from the ledge. They disarm the torpedo, surface the submarine surrounded by American ships, and slowly sail home.
Vasily Arkhipov, an unknown, exhausted man in a tin can at the bottom of the ocean, literally saved the world. It is the most profound poetic justice in all of modern history.
It really is.
We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing a century of elite politicians, wealthy aristocrats, and arrogant emperors making grand, secret deals in beautiful palaces that ended up slaughtering tens of millions of people. And when the ultimate consequence of those century-long deals finally arrived the absolute brink of total human annihilation, it was an ordinary low-ranking officer, simply refusing to pull the trigger, who spared us all.
It gives me chills every time I hear it. After coming that incredibly close to the edge, looking right over the precipice into the abyss, the superpowers realized they had to find a new way to operate. The tension was unsustainable. Which leads us to our final section, Détente in the Fall.
They lean back into secret diplomacy once again, but this time, the goal isn't to start wars or conquer territory. The goal is to de-escalate and survive.
The 1970s arrive. The landscape has changed. The Vietnam War is bleeding America dry, both financially and morally. The relentless, astronomical cost of the nuclear arms race is bankrupting the Soviet Union. Both superpowers are deeply exhausted.
So what changes?
President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, decide to play a bold, incredibly risky diplomatic gambit to change the balance of power, the China card.
For decades, the communist bloc was viewed by the West as a monolith, a single, united, terrifying red menace spanning from East Berlin all the way to Beijing. But Kissinger, studying intelligence reports, realized a critical flaw in that assumption. The Soviet Union and Communist China actually despised each other.
They weren't a united front at all.
Not at all. They had engaged in violent border skirmishes. They were fiercely fighting for ideological supremacy over the communist world. Kissinger thinks if America can secretly make friends with China, It will absolutely terrify the Soviet Union, surround them with enemies, and force them to the negotiating table to beg for arms control.
It was a brilliant geopolitical wedge. So in July 1971, while on a highly publicized routine diplomatic tour in Pakistan, Kissinger fakes a severe stomachache. He claims he is terribly ill and needs to rest in a remote hill station away from the
A
press.
classic misdirection.
While the global media is completely fooled waiting outside his door,
Yeah.
Kissinger secretly boards a Pakistani plane under the cover of darkness and flies straight into Beijing.
He meets quietly, face-to-face, with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, laying the groundwork for a massive diplomatic shift. When the news finally breaks months later that staunchly anti-communist Richard Nixon himself is going to formally visit communist China in 1972, the world is absolutely shocked. It was a diplomatic earthquake that realigned the globe.
And Kissinger's calculated manipulation worked perfectly. The Soviet leadership in Moscow completely panicked at the nightmare thought of a U.S.-China military alliance aimed at them. Desperate to keep America engaged with them instead of Beijing, the Soviets immediately invite Nixon to Moscow just months later.
Which leads to real progress.
This sudden desperation leads directly to the signing of SALT the Staten, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. It was the very first major, verifiable agreement to finally put a legal cap on the runaway nuclear arms race. A secret, deceitful trip to Beijing intentionally slowed down the machinery of doomsday.
But the Cold War didn't ultimately end with a nuclear bomb. It ended with a piece of paper. The final diplomatic pivot from our historical record concerns the Helsinki Accords of 1975. 35 nations signed this massive agreement.
How did the Soviets view it?
The Soviet Union viewed it as a massive historic victory because the West finally officially recognized the post-World War II borders of Eastern Europe, permanently solidifying Soviet physical control over their satellite states. Stalin's dream realized.
But the Accords contained a hidden dagger that the Soviets completely underestimated. In exchange for granting that border recognition, the West insisted on adding specific clauses regarding universal human rights, freedom of speech, and freedom of thought.
The aging Soviet leadership scoffed and agreed, thinking, they are just empty words on a piece of paper. We have the KGB. We can ignore them inside our own borders.
They couldn't ignore them. Because they signed it, those words, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, were legally required to be published in official Soviet newspapers like Pravda.
Which gave the people ammunition.
Dissidents living in Eastern Europe, brave people like playwright Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, seized upon those words. They created Helsinki watch groups. They used the Soviet Union's own publicly signed treaty as an unassailable legal basis to demand basic rights, to protest censorship, and to slowly, meticulously dismantle the moral authority of the Soviet Empire from within.
That piece of paper, containing a clause the Soviets thought was a joke, became the intellectual crowbar that eventually helped bring down the Berlin Wall in 1989.
Which brings us to the end of our historical journey, and to the synthesis of what this century of closed doors means for us today.
We've traveled from the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 all the way through the fall of the Cold War. And as we mentioned at the very beginning, if you look at the entirety of this history, there are 3 massive, unavoidable lessons for anyone paying attention today.
Let's recap them.
Number 1, secret diplomacy almost always backfires. From Bismarck's arrogant double booking of alliances, to the Sykes-Picot map that destabilized the Middle East, to Stalin's disastrous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact when elite diplomats make deals in the dark, the resulting friction and paranoia usually end up burning the house down.
Number 2, appeasement is a fatal illusion. When you reward an aggressor with territory or concessions to avoid conflict, as Chamberlain did with Hitler at Munich by sacrificing Czechoslovakia, you do not buy peace. You just make the aggressor bolder, stronger, and better equipped for the war they are inevitably going to start anyway.
And number 3, the most resonant, painful lesson of all here. Small countries are always the ones who pay the price. Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Arab states, Korea, Vietnam. When the giants wrestle, it's the grass that gets trampled. The grand deals made by superpowers always treat smaller, sovereign nations as expendable poker chips to be traded for temporary security.
And we absolutely cannot relegate these lessons to the dusty pages of the past. If you look at the geopolitical landscape today, it is impossible to ignore the echoes. We see rising tensions between the U.S. and Russia in Eastern Europe, or the U.S. and China over the status of Taiwan. We see the exact same architecture of rigid alliance systems, massive military buildups, and intense backroom posturing that defined Europe in the summer of 1914.
The players have changed, the weapons are infinitely more terrifying hypersonic missiles instead of dreadnoughts, but the basic human psychology of the diplomats reading the intelligence reports in those closed rooms remains uncomfortably dangerously similar.
We must critically ask ourselves, what secret deals are shaping the Middle East right now? What quiet, unspoken understandings exist between modern superpowers regarding red lines that the public won't learn about for another 50 years?
It's a sobering thought.
Which brings me to a final, slightly uncomfortable thought. I want to leave you, our listener, to chew on. We opened this deep dive by talking about how we naturally look for villains, the loud madmen on the podiums. And we've spent the last hour exposing the catastrophic damage caused by the quiet men in the closed, secret rooms.
It seems incredibly obvious that the solution is total transparency. Woodrow Wilson's dream of open covenants, openly arrived at. Everything on camera, everything public.
But is it? Here is the provocative question to mull over tonight. If secrecy in diplomacy has historically caused so much catastrophic damage, is total, absolute transparency actually the cure?
How do you mean?
Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. If Kennedy and Khrushchev had to negotiate that Turkey-Cuba nuclear missile swap entirely in public, under the glaring, unforgiving lights of modern 24/7 media and social networks, facing immense pressure from their own furious military hardliners not to compromise, would they have been able to make the deal?
That's a great point. They might have been forced to fight.
Exactly. Or would seeing the raw, unpolished, terrifying sausage-making of global survival just push the public into a massive panic, locking our leaders into rigid corners and terrifying us into a nuclear war even faster? Maybe, just maybe, the closed door is sometimes the only quiet place where compromise can breathe. Let that simmer.
A chilling but absolutely necessary question for the modern age.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the shadows of history. Keep questioning what you read, always look for the hidden clauses, and we will see you next time.